honored to be I'm extremely honored to be moderating this extremely excellent panel. We are joined by academicians from the region and from abroad, Mr. Jagannath Pandey, Mr. Gopi Krishna, and Dr. Arshad Ali. We formally begin by introducing the subject that today we'll be talking about, that is analyzing trajectory of India's foreign relations. We're saying that strategic autonomy has been of primary value and a continuous ambition of India's foreign policy since its inception. And this concept, which was originally defined in terms of non-alignment, it has always remained at the heart of India's global interaction. We've seen that previously in the era of Cold War, this India's non-alignment policy was more inclined towards securing its strategic autonomy. But as we see a shift in world politics, we also witness that another term, another concept, or let's say another theory, which is known as the non-alignment 2.0, which has taken its center stage, which basically defines the dynamics of India's internal and external growth through an interlinked lens. So what we see today is a very sweet balancing of India's foreign relations while it's practicing a multi-alignment strategy and also portraying itself as someone who is a worshipper of a non-alignment policy. So to engage our audience and to learn from our learned speakers, we would like to analyze how the trajectory of India's foreign relations, external relations, has been appearing in the international arena. And for that very reason, I would like to introduce our very first speaker for today. That's Dr. Jagannath Pandey. Dr. Jagannath is the head of Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. He is also the editor for ISDP. In addition to his primary appointment at the ISDP, Dr. Panda is the director for Europe or Asia Research Corporation at the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies and a senior fellow at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Dr. Panda also holds a number of adjunct affiliations in various think tanks and institutions in Asia and Indo-Pacific. With any further ado, I would now like to hand over the floor to Dr. Jagannath for his discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lareb. It's a great pleasure to be here with the Institute of Regional Studies in Islamabad. Thank you very much for inviting me. Also, great pleasure to talk to the Pakistani colleagues on a topic where there is bound to be difference between India and Pakistan. But again, this is an academic debate. This is an academic forum, and I'm happy to share my thoughts. And also great to be here with the panelists, Dr. Arshad Ali and Dr. Gopi Bhamidipati. If I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your names incorrectly, but I think, yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here and sharing some of my thoughts. And I think the title of this theme of today's discussion explains a lot. Here, we are talking about the trajectory, the evolution of Indian foreign policy. And I think as it goes with every foreign policy, probably foreign policy trajectories are not really revolutionary in nature. Of course, history suggests that there is a revolutionary discourse to foreign policy, and many countries' foreign policy has transformed through revolutions. But again, here we are talking about a democratic country. Here we are talking about a democratic, inclusive society where the Constitution of India believes in secularism. And considering all of those aspects that is mentioned in the Indian constitutions, and I think here we are talking about India's foreign policy trajectory in an evolutionary context. And I think one of the fundamental about Indian foreign policy is that I think the core premise of Indian foreign policy post independence, which actually witnessed the division of, unfortunately, the division of India and Pakistan. There we saw that the core primacy of Indian foreign policy was based on Nehruvian thought. Nehru's, foreign policy thoughts, his international outlook to put India in the global map and global radar. And therefore, what we saw in the subsequent years of 3 to 4 decades, Indian foreign policy observing to, most of the ideas that Prime Minister Nehru had articulated. So what we called a kind of Nehruvian foreign policy. And of course, that's a definitely contested terminology, because within the ruling Congress party, there were different views and there were different contested views about whether the Nehruvian thoughts about Indian foreign policy or India's posturing in international map was a correct, visionary idea. But again, I think definitely post-independence, 3 to 4 decades of Indian foreign policy was very much, dominated by Nehruvian thoughts. And therefore, I think it is not necessarily a wrong phenomenon to, club Indian foreign policy as a Nehruvian dominated foreign policy. Now, today, what we see, there is a slight departure has happened. And this departure, whether for good or bad, that is for the forum to decide. Probably a number of other forums has to decide. But what definitely we see today, that Indian foreign policy has definitely moved out of its so-called Nehruvian foreign policy prison. And there is a new anatomy of contested terminology that has emerged as a dominant theme in Indian foreign policy. That is a Hinduism-oriented foreign policy. A transition, or let's say a departure from Nehruvian foreign policy to a Hindu-oriented, Hinduism-oriented for Indian foreign policy. Now, what is this Hinduism-oriented foreign policy or Hinduist-oriented foreign policy? I mean, of course, there are right-wing leaders who strongly articulate by saying that, the majority of Indian foreign policy and majority of Indian population belongs to the Hindu-oriented analogy, and therefore there is a strong Hindu-oriented foreign policy, spirits attached to Indian foreign policy today. But I do see it as an inclusive and much more rightist centrist, idea in Indian foreign policy, even though it is much more Hindu-oriented nationalist foreign policy. But I do strongly feel that there is an inclusive platform for other religions, other society, other spectrum of the society, as it is mentioned in the Indian constitution. Of course, debates within India still continues. There are political rivalries, political debates, which suggest that probably this transition is not really healthy for India. But then, we have to wait and watch about that transition, whether this transition is happening for a good or for a bad. But again, I think, Chair Ms. Lareb pointed out an interesting point about the non-aligned discourse of foreign policy. So what we have seen is that within that broad canvas of Nehruvian, or let's say today, the Hinduism foreign policy idea, there was a kind of strong connotation of non-aligned foreign policy. And this non-aligned foreign policy today, no matter how much we discard it in Indian foreign policy, it still exists. And it imbibes about India's past culture of not taking any side, not to be a part of the partisan politics, and try to observe and as much as neutral or equicordial foreign policy relations. And I think today, when we are talking about the trajectory of Indian foreign policy, I would suggest that definitely it has transitioned to some extent from non-aligned foreign policy to a multi-aligned foreign policy. And within that multi-aligned foreign policy, today what we see that India is increasingly advocating and talking about strategic autonomy, that it makes sense for India's foreign policy interest to stay connected with all the countries, no matter they are major powers or middle powers. Most interestingly, what is strategic autonomy is talking about? That India does not have to take a position on each and every international conflict. So that means the bottom line of the strategic autonomy lies with equicordial and equidistant relationship. And therefore, when we are talking about a trajectory of Indian foreign policy, if we talk about history, post-independence, India did take that kind of position to have an equicordial and equidistant relations. There are strong examples. For example, the Korean War. Of course, It goes much before the the independence. But then Korea War is a strong example where India actually maintained a equicordial relations with North Korea and South Korea, and also maintain a equidistance when it comes to the power politics there. Neither with the Soviet Union-led politics or Chinese-supported Soviet Union politics, not to the US-led politics there. So India was much more neutral. In fact, India played a significant role under the UN, try to diffuse the war scenarios there. Of course, India was not really successful. So historically, also we did was strategic autonomy being a critical element in foreign policy discourse. But today, I think I have written about this. What is most interestingly to note about Indian foreign policy, and possibly about the trajectory of India's external foreign policy relations, is that while India is talking about strategic autonomy, when India is talking about multi-aligned foreign policy, within that multi-aligned and strategic autonomy foreign policy discourse, India is also talking about pointed alignment strategy. And I think that is something needs to be noted. And I have written about this, and this has been one of my key terminology in Indian foreign policy, advocacy. And in my recent write-ups over the last 2 years, I've frequently written about this, that today what we see in Indian foreign policy, there is a pointed alignment strategy emerging within that multi-aligned foreign policy strategy. And what is this pointed alignment strategy? The pointed alignment strategy is that India is not really hesitant to take a position on conflicting issues, to execute its national interest. And to that effect, we see that India is showing a lot of interest towards Quad formulation in Indo-Pacific. India is imbibing to the Indo-Pacific discourse, that is Indo-Pacific narrative that is emerging continuously. And also there are minilateral, multilateral, smaller frameworks is emerging in world politics, to which India is subscribing more and more and quite often. And therefore, what we are seeing within a multi-aligned foreign policy discourse, where strategic autonomy is a more defined aspects of Indian foreign policy, within that broader umbrella, there is a pointed alignment strategy emerging. And this pointed alignment strategy also talks about India's foreign policy approach to stay connected with the major powers, with the middle powers, and also with the smaller powers. At the same time, this pointed alignment strategy is more about taking position and executing India's national interest accordingly. For example, when it comes to US-led architecture, India wants to execute its security interest. When it comes to the economic interest, even though during the pandemic, we have seen that India is trying to maintain a distance and talking about alternative supply chains. But then before the pandemic, Indian foreign policy was much more China-centric. India was strongly connected with China as an economic power. And as an economic partner, there are AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Bank, there are NDB, New Development Bank under the BRICS, there are SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, there are Russia, India, China trilaterals. There are a number of forums where India is strongly connected with China and Russia. So this explains about India's pointed alignment strategy, that India would like to strongly stay connected, no matter whether they are friendly countries or countries of not so friendly in nature, and to execute its national interests. So to that extent, I think pointed alignment strategy is a new framework in Indian foreign policy within that multi-aligned foreign policy framework that is emerging. Now, I will stop here sharing some critical thoughts in Indian foreign policy, that I think in order to understand the trajectory of India's foreign policy and India's external relations, I think we have to identify the central features in Indian foreign policy. And to my mind, I have just noted down 10 central features in Indian foreign policy, and I'll just point it out so that I think it becomes clear that what I am talking about within that pointed alignment strategy when Indian foreign policy is very much multi-aligned foreign policy today. First, I think there is a focus about minilateralism. Of course, we have seen that there are a range of multilateral institutions, multilateral frameworks within Indo-Pacific and outside Indo-Pacific, but within that configuration, India is focusing a lot on unilateral configuration. For example, Quad, India, US, Australia, and Japan. For example, let's say about IPEF, Indo-Pacific Foreign Policy Economic Forum. For example, let's say about India, Japan, and Australia trilateral, India, US, Japan trilateral. So there are unilaterals, trilaterals, and quadrilaterals initiatives, and that talks about Indian foreign policy trajectory today. India is focusing a lot on unilateral configuration. Second, I think India is focusing a lot on maritime domains, and I think this maritime, the focus on the maritime domain is more about revitalize the traditionalist orientation of having India a kind of maritime power. And I think the whole idea is to revive India's maritime diplomacy with the Indian Ocean region countries. Third, India is focusing a lot on connectivity and corridors. If we see about India's geography is exposed to, India's land corridors are exposed to, three zones onto the maritime domains. And I think there is a increasing focus about Indian Ocean. There is a increasing focus about Bay of Bengal. There is a increasing focus on the West Asian, domains. So therefore, there is a enormous focus about connectivity and corridors, particularly on the maritime connectivity and maritime corridors. The fourth, there is a focus about infrastructure diplomacy. If we talk about India's relationship with Japan, India's relationship with the US, India's relationship with ASEAN, India's relationship with Australia, in each of this relationship, we are talking about infrastructure diplomacy. We are opposing China's Belt and Road initiatives, and we are taking part in all of these activities. Fifth, I think there is a enormous geographic importance on the continental aspects, which was not earlier the case. Today, I think even though Indian foreign policy is not really that powerful like the Chinese foreign policy today, because the Chinese foreign policy, I categorically see it's a very powerful foreign policy because China operates from a position of strength. China's economy is 4 to 5 times higher than the Indian economy. So there is an enormous importance about China as a global power. So therefore, China has a stronger continental outreach. That was not the case in India. But I think with the current government in Delhi, there is a deliberate attempt to reach out to all the continents across the world. Today, India has a significant outreach in the Africa. Whether it is getting successful or not successful, that's a different story. But when it comes to the outreach program, we have seen India has a strong outreach in Africa. India has a strong outreach also in Europe, which was not the case earlier. In fact, despite of the fact that India has supported Russia and has not really been maintaining a pro-Ukraine position on the Ukraine war, and that has annoyed to some extent the European community. But India, Prime Minister Modi actually visited Europe, and India has expanded its outreach in the European continent. So the continental aspects, outreach aspects in Indian foreign policy is very much visible. Number 6, I think there is a vigilantism in Indian foreign policy. There is an enormous, concrete foreign policy planning in Indian foreign policy about conflicting issues, be it South China Sea, be it China-India boundary dispute, be it East China Sea dispute, be it critical other issues which are much more bilateral in nature. There is an enormous importance in foreign policy today that these are the issues what India needs to really take into account much more seriously. Number 7, I think Indian foreign policy has become much more China-centric. It is one thing to say that Indian foreign policy is Westly, very much West-aligned foreign policy. It is a pro-US led foreign policy. But again, I think it would be wrong to discard how much China has actually, taken the place in Indian foreign policy. So today, whatever foreign policy initiatives or new ideas are emerging in Indian foreign policy today, much of these ideas are directly or indirectly linked with the China factor. So therefore, we can say that Indian foreign policy is definitely much more China-focused foreign policy today. Number 8, I think there is an autonomous orientation thinking has emerged in Indian foreign policy. This was very much during Nehru's time, but in subsequent years, I think that autonomous way of thinking about India's foreign policy and global affairs lost it out. We did see during Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's tenure some sort of autonomous thinking in Indian foreign policy. Also, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh brought some kind of autonomous thinking in Indian foreign policy. But today, what we are seeing that Prime Minister Modi is not really hesitant to take a position on conflicting issues. At the same time, showing a much more courageous, attempt in Indian foreign policy to reach out to the opponents. In fact, we saw the same thing. He reached out to Pakistan in the initial years. He also reached out to China, realizing that China will be a great danger in the future in Indian foreign policy. So I think that kind of autonomous foreign policy, innovative thinking has emerged in the foreign policy, no matter how much nationalist oriented foreign policy we currently currently notice under the Modi government currently in Delhi. I think last 2 points are, I think there is a enormous focus in Indian foreign policy relations about the neighborhood. And I think therefore, there is a concept about neighborhood first foreign policy under Modi government. But again, we know for a fact that probably the neighborhood foreign policy in India is not really getting successful. Probably it is not really giving adequate result and rewards to Indian foreign policy the way the current government in Delhi thought about it. But again, within that success and failure prism, and I think definitely in order to maintain a much more steady relationship with the neighbors, that has been one of the foreign policy targets of the current government. Of course, the relationship with Pakistan has not really improved, but that's a different aspect of Indian foreign policy. We can talk about it during the Q&A. The last feature of the Indian foreign policy is that I think what we are seeing today, interestingly, that India is also looking at it beyond the immediate neighborhood. That means there is a focus about extended neighborhood in Indian foreign policy relations framework. And I think in this extended neighborhood, ASEAN has emerged as a stronger geographic region in Indian foreign policy. West Asia is emerging as a stronger component in Indian foreign policy. Most importantly, the Indian Ocean regions, what we call primarily, the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific regions, is emerging as a critical domain in Indian foreign policy. So when we talk about the central features of Indian foreign policy, I'll just list it out very briefly before stopping. Focus on multilateralism. Number 2, maritime focus. Number 3, connectivity and corridor focus. Number 4, there is a focus about infrastructure diplomacy. Number 5, there is a focus about the continental aspects in Indian foreign policy, continental outreach. Number 6, there is a vigilantism or a enormous focus on conflicting issues in Indian foreign policy. Number 7, there is a focus about China, enormous focus about China. Number 8, a kind of a autonomous foreign policy thinking emerging within a nationalist canvas of foreign policy. And number 9, there is a focus about neighborhood first, neighborhood diplomacy. Number 10, I think India is looking at the extended neighborhood diplomacy, and that has emerged as a critical facet of Indian foreign policy. I'll stop here and probably welcome some of your comments and thoughts in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. This was extremely critically analyzed, and you've rightly pointed out that the transition of Indian foreign policy from a Nehruvian foreign policy to a Hindu-oriented foreign policy has not come as healthy per se, because if India wants to remain in the world politics and give its fair share in the minilaterals or the ocean politics or whatsoever, it needs to be inclusive, and it needs to come off as a democratic state. And I think you're right, we can continue this discussion later on in the question and answer session. With that being said, I would now introduce our next speaker for today. That is Mr. Gopi Krishna Bhamidipati. He is pursuing his PhD in the Planning, Governance, and Globalization program at the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech, Arlington. His academic interests are India, West Asia affairs, specifically focusing on India's relations with Israel, Iran, and the GCC. Prior to this, Mr. Gopi was a journalist working with the UAE, where he contributed stories and narrated international news at various TV and radio news stations for over 10 years. In India, Mr. Gopi switched roles, working behind the scenes as a news producer while continuing to contribute content for various primetime television programs. Without any further ado, I would now like to hand over the floor to Mr. Bhamidipati. Over to you, sir.
Sir, your mic is not working. We can't hear you, sir. Yeah,
Yes.
now you are audible.
Let's see if you can hear me now. Can you?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you. I was saying thank you so much, Mr. Ali, for the introduction. It's really nice to be here. So Dr. Panda has covered a lot of what I had to say, but then I'll speak about a few things that I believe are relevant to the conversation. Obviously, we're speaking about the concept of strategic autonomy. It has multiple connotations. It was called non-alignment. It was called non-alignment 2.0. It was called strategic autonomy more recently after 2014. A multi-alignment strategy and the omni-alignment. You call it whatever it is, but these are essentially. I don't think that they define different periods and different policies. Strategic autonomy has been a central component of India's policy ever since India's independence. Like Dr. Panda said, it originated with Prime Minister Nehru's foreign policy doctrine, which basically spoke about the ideas of independence, civilizational entity, autonomy of decision making, which are the key attributes of India's strategic culture as well. And they were the key tenets of that particular policy were obviously not joining blocs in terms of the US and Soviet Union at the point in time, which was a bipolar order at the point. And the increasing focus on third worldism, third world solidarity, non-interference in other countries' affairs, non-aggression, equality for all, self-determination, and internationalism. So these are some of the tenets that we practiced during that point in time. And so essentially it was independence in action, both in our domestic affairs and our foreign relations. We wanted to be a free nation with our own policy and not merely as a satellite for another nation. So that was non-alignment during. It was sort of a mirror of those times that was designed. More recently, in 2012, there was a policy paper, and it was mentioned that it was called Non-Alignment 2.0, and there were esteemed authors who have written it, including Pratap Bhanu Mehta and others, Shiv Shankar and many others. So basically, they were saying that their focus was the success of India's own internal development will depend decisively on how effectively we manage our global opportunities in order to maximize our choices. So basically, there was this linkage between India's national interests with the interests of other nations. Previously, there was this feeling that it was internal balancing. India needs to take care of its own self on behalf of or leaving external relations with other countries. But that has not been the case. What we are seeing increasingly is the growth is intertwined because this is a multipolar and interdependent world. We cannot grow at the expense of others. So this is increasingly interdependent world. So that is where the concept of strategic autonomy has been defined in terms of a multi-alignment strategy. So basically, it is a function of power capabilities. No country can practice strategic autonomy without having the power capabilities, and also it depends on the international structure of a particular country. So there are four strands, as far as my understanding is concerned, to this concept of strategic autonomy. Basically, it's multilateralism at a global level. As Dr. Panda mentioned, we are increasingly aligning with climate negotiations at the global level. There are WTO negotiations that are happening at the same time. So that is at the global level. And there is bilateralism increasingly with neighbors and strategic partners. And there is increasingly a participation today in terms of multilateral groups or informal groupings. These are selected coalition partners. Some would call it the coalition of the willing. And so this is a multi-alignment strategy that we're talking about. And I2U2, which is the recent grouping which has emerged very recently, is a manifestation of this particular trend. And so these are coalition partners which already have bilateral relations with each other. And they are focusing on increasingly issues like food security, climate change, and other issues which cannot be solved by each and every single by countries alone. So, for example, climate change is a factor that is affecting everyone. So India, which is focusing on UAE, for UAE, food security is a huge problem. So India can contribute in that particular sense. So there's a complementarity of interests. And that's why we see a grouping like ITU2. To dig more into it, so this is a rising trend, as Dr. Panda mentioned again. This is a new trend. This is sort of a new normal that we're seeing, the rise of unilateralism. Also, we can question as to why this has happened at a certain point in time, as to why is this happening today. Because obviously this is a multipolar world order. The US is in decline, or is a declining superpower. It is pivoting to Asia. There is a power vacuum right now in West Asia, and at this point in time, we don't know who's going to fill that particular vacuum. And India, which is sort of increasingly connected on the east and west, so India is in a better position to fill that particular vacuum. And the rise of forums like ITU2, it gives India an opportunity to play that particular role in a more abrasive and let's say more assertive way. And obviously, this is the setting was well placed by the inception of Abraham Accords in 2020. That set the trend for India, and also this ITU2 group was also called Indo-Abrahamic Accord or West Asia Accord. So comparisons with Quad was already taking place. Although this particular grouping doesn't have any notion of an anti-Iran or anti-China grouping, which was also considered a misnomer. So instead, so basically, what's happening is the geoeconomics are replacing geopolitics here. Increasingly, Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy is focusing on economic diplomacy. So there is a lot of activism. There is a lot of muscular foreign policy that he is looking at. He believes that India is supposed to have the right place in this Committee of Nations. He intends to take India forward as a great power in that direction. So increasingly, India's focus is on West Asia as a theater for great power status, and its increasing relations with UAE, with all the Gulf nations, in fact, and Israel is riding that particular direction. So as you can see, some of the issues that the ITU2 was focusing on was on water, energy, transportation, space, health, and food security. So all these issues cannot be taken care of by countries like UAE or US or India alone. They'll have to be done in an interdependent way, and that's where I think the world is heading. And so for India, there are commonalities of interest here. There are economic exchanges with Israel, the Gulf, and the US, and there are complementarity of interest here. If you can see what happened, UAE has invested close to $2 billion to develop high-tech integrated food parks across the country, and something that has not been done before, and it has only happened because of this particular grouping. And US is also funding a feasibility study here. And so we see that what's happening with India's relationship is like a concentric circles for me. So there is the immediate neighborhood, there is the extended neighborhood, which covers West Asia, and there is the international community, and there are relationships happening with Russia, China, and US simultaneously. And so India is in such a position that India cannot let go of one country's relationship at the expense of the other. So the other aspect of this particular focus on strategic autonomy is because, let's say, India has a relationship with Israel on one side and Iran on the other, and it can't let go of these two countries, and India is sort of playing a balancing act here. So that is where we are seeing, and it is also happening at this point in time because of a multipolar world order, and it gives a space to countries like India, which are rising powers, to play that particular role. And so this is where I believe the policy is headed. I'll open, if there are any questions, I'll get on with it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhamidipati. It was very, very informative, and you're quite very right that India's transition from a non-alignment approach to a multi-alignment approach is a very smart move, because then otherwise in an interdependent world, being very non-aligned would be so naive of India that it would not help its foreign policy go further. So I think we can discuss later on the further aspects of it in the question and answer session. For the audience listening to us, you're very free to pose your questions in the chat box, and we would narrate and direct them to the speakers one by one in the question and answer sessions. Thank you. With that, we move forward to our very last speaker, Dr. Arshad Ali. Dr. Arshad Ali is Director, India Study Center at the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad. Previously, Dr. Arshad worked as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Management and Technology, Lahore, where he has taught different courses related to international security at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Dr. Arshad has actively participated as a presenter, discussant, mentor, and organizer in various national and international conferences and workshops. With that being said, I would now like to hand over the mic to Dr. Arshad. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Larry, and Institute of Regional Studies. I've just recently joined Institute of Strategic Studies as a Director, India Study Center, and I'm really happy that the IRS has taken this initiative to understand the Indian foreign policy. And I think one of the aspects which Dr. Jagannath and Mr. Gopi talked about, especially Dr. Jagannath, about the regional security. India is facing problems when it comes to deal with its neighborhood. So I think we need to have such a kind of webinars so that we can discuss. And for that, with the perspective of Pakistan, I think it is a need that we should understand Indian foreign policy with the new realities, or with the we can say in the contemporary international political environment, so that we can come up with some sort of solution to the problems which has been historical, like if we talked about the issue of Kashmir, or if we talked about any other issues, bilateral issues between India and Pakistan. So for that, I think understanding India's recently trajectory of India's external relation, it is very much important. And with that, we can come up with some policies, or with some sort of solution to mutually coexist, or to come up with some kind of regional solution to the problem which we are facing in South Asia. So coming back to the topic, I will be very brief because Dr. Jagannath and Gopi, he has covered many points which I have noted down here. So I would not repeat that. I will try because most of the points has been already discussed. So I will be very brief, but at the same time, a little bit academic. So bear with me with that. So I will discuss briefly about strategic autonomy, non-alignment, and then I will focus more on the India's strategic restraint. And then we can discuss about that, whether India is moving from more a strategic restraint towards a more offensive postures with its economic growth, with its military modernization, and as well as with its rapprochement with India, and then participating in these multilateral forum which Dr. Jagannath and Mr. Gopi talked about that. So when we talk about strategic autonomy, so it is defined as the ability to set priorities and make decisions in matters of foreign policy and security, together with institutional, political, and material ability to carry these through in cooperation with third parties, or if need be alone. So autonomy is always relative. Politically, it means growing readiness or a process rather than a condition. Autonomy is a means to protect and promote countries' values and its national interests. When we talk about countries that have strong strategic autonomy, like in case of United States of America or Russia, so we can say that they are being able to set or modify and enforce its international rules, and as opposed to unwillingly obeying rules set by others. The opposite of strategic autonomy is being a role taker subject to strategic decision made by others, the United States, China, or Russia more recently. So subsequently, we see that now India is trying to act more autonomy to show its strategic autonomy. So we have to see that. In terms of like when we wanted to understand India's current strategic autonomy, we need to look into its history. So in order to understand India's strategic behavior, we need to see its alliance behavior, which was long associated with the principle of non-alignment. The non-alignment principle was set by its founding father, as mentioned by the speakers, Jawaharlal Nehru. So when we talked about this non-alignment strategy, why India has adopted this? So non-alignment sought to steer India's an independent course in foreign affairs. So what India was trying to do was to have more independent foreign policy, and this we have seen during the Cold War that India has tried to become neutral or to become non-aligned. Nehru believed that alignment has created conflicts of war and colonialism. So if we talk about the past, so when you are engaged with one alignment or with the other alignment, so then it created problems or it created wars. So in order to avoid that and to have more independent policies, so the Indian leadership at that time, they have adopted this non-alignment policy. So thus Nehru approach was more a pragmatic approach to avoid alliance, commitment to form their own course in international politics. It is generally believed that India has maintained non-alignment during the Cold War, which I just mentioned. In terms of strategic restraint, we need to see that whether India has maintained a strategic restraint or not. So after India's independence in 1947, India's foreign policy response to global security environment and neighborhood security scenario has been influenced by two different sets of strategic thinking under the rubric of non-alignment foreign policy. While the response to global security atmosphere was characterized by peaceful, diplomatic, and collective approaches, the non-alignment policy response was marked by a hard power approach, as we have seen their military standoff with the neighboring countries. Moreover, India was by no means neutral during the Cold War, as we have seen that India has somehow maintained a strategic relationship with the Soviet Union. In terms of when we talked about its rivalry with China, so China began a process of a rapid economic and military expansion, becoming even more of a potent danger to India than it had been in the past, as discussed by Dr. Jagannath. Faced with these new structural realities, India's foreign policy adjusted once again, pursuing a close strategic partnership with the United States, despite decade of Cold War antagonism, or they were not aligned with the US. But after the end of the Cold War, we see that India has started rapprochement with the United States, and it has played a bigger role. If we see the current posture or foreign policy of India, so the rapprochement with India has played a bigger role in that. But one other aspect which is very much important is India's economic liberalization in the post-Cold War era, and it helped a lot India in terms of its economic growth. And even when we talked about today, India's military modernization, so it has played a bigger role in that. The policies which India adopted in terms of economic liberalization after the end of the Cold War. So thus India's security policy is guided more by pragmatism than by moralism. Like normally it has been talked about that India's policy is more in terms of moralism. So it is not based on moralism, but it's more a pragmatic approach. So when they were trying to have their own independent policy at the beginning or right after independence, so they have adopted this non-alignment. But when they have achieved economic growth and then they have achieved some sort of military modernization and at the same time become a nuclear power country, so India has started showing its aggressive posture or tried to resolve issues even with the neighboring countries, like in the case of Pakistan and India, they have engaged in some sort of, in fact, they have fought 3 major wars and some limited wars as well. So when we talk about strategic autonomy, so this will help us in order to understand with the words of Jay Shankar, this is the time for us to engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies of support. So if we look into the words of Jaishankar, so it's more in the line with that, how India is trying the major powers as well as in its neighborhood with a more with the perspective of strategic autonomy. But here we need to see at one point which Dr. Jagannath he highlighted the Hindutva outlook of Indian foreign policy, which we have to see that how it will shape Indian foreign policy. In the 1970s or 80s, we tried this in Pakistan, it did not work. So I'm not sure how it will turn Indian foreign policy, which we need to see and which we need to discuss. So with these, I would like to thank you. And if there is any question, so we can discuss that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. That was very informative. We now move towards to the question and answer session, and I think we can begin with Dr. Ali because he just talked about the military modernization of India, and we have a very relevant question to that from Ms. Mariam Masood from the Institute of Regional Studies. She's of the opinion that do the Indian military forces, what do you think? Do you think they have any role to play in the foreign policy, in the making of foreign policy of India? Besides that, any opinion speakers can answer this as well. Thank you.
Let me I will be very brief, and I would like that Mr. Gopi and Dr. Jagannath, they would have more insight. But from the outside, what I see or what we see that, especially in the recent past, or we can say during the Modi regime, we have seen that the Indian, if we can look into that after the Shimla Accord, specifically when we talked about India and Pakistan relationship. So India has shown strategic restraint from Shimla Accord in 1971 until the Pulwama attack, and after that, then we have so this shows that with its economic growth and with military modernization, and then they are part of different alignment, especially the Quad or the recently I2U2 summit. So India is now showing its assertiveness or its aggressive posture. So definitely the Indian military has a role to play. So traditionally we have seen that during Nehru time or later on, it was more the civilian or the Indian culture. It dominated the Indian strategic culture. But recently, like it seems that the Indian military, they are playing a role in its foreign policy, or at least it is trying to influence that.
Dr. Panda, would you like to comment?
I thought that was for you, similar occurred question to you, but let me also address this thing. I think I do not think that Indian foreign policy has really become aggressive or assertive. You are referring to the I2U2 proposition and few other foreign policy alignments that India is having. I think these are aspirational initiatives in foreign policy. And I think India wants to stay engaged with as many as possible with the power blocks, with the power frameworks that are emerging. And therefore, in my presentation, what I mentioned is that within that broader framework of aligning more with multilateralism, India is participating more seriously with minilateralism, with minilateral foreign policy. So I do not think this alignment of joining in minilateral initiatives are any indication of any aggressiveness. But yes, we could understand probably is that the relationship with Pakistan has not been in order, but this is nothing new. I think after the independence, relationship with Pakistan has never been in order. For a brief period when Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee started the boss diplomacy and various initiatives, on most part of the history, the relationship has not been in good order. So we cannot really blame a particular government or particular initiative. I think there are factors which are responsible for this deterioration in the relationship between India and Pakistan from both sides. But while saying that, I think what is really clearly visible in Indian foreign policy, probably Pakistan is becoming a lesser significant actor in Indian foreign policy. There was a period in Indian foreign policy where Pakistan used to be the main fulcrum of Indian foreign policy, but today Pakistan is not really the main driver in Indian foreign policy. China has overtaken that space. So Indian foreign policy today is much more China-centric, and India does feel most of the security concerns and security threats from China rather than Pakistan. And I think there is a unanimous views in Delhi. There is a unanimous views all across India. Probably India has become a much superior power to Pakistan. At the same time, India has become a much inferior power, a lesser inferior power to China. And I think there is a systemic configuration in the power trajectory in Asia, and that's the reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. There is another question for you by a research analyst, Dr. Imran Sardar. How you differentiate your pointed alignment strategic foreign policy from regional control strategy being discussed in India's foreign policy discourse, particularly in reference to Afghanistan?
Well, this is an interesting question, but I would differentiate by saying is that I think every country would like to assess their foreign policy from the positioning of their economic situation. And I think when it comes to the Afghanistan situation, when it comes to the neighborhood diplomacy, India is a bigger economy to the regions. And I think from there, you will see probably a more imposing foreign policy than an assertive foreign policy. So today, what we are seeing in Indian foreign policy, a much more involving and imposing foreign policy, strategy. And therefore, within that pointed alignment strategy, India is employing both bilateral, trilateral, as well as multilateral initiatives when it deals with the regions of Afghanistan. For example, of course, India is a actor which is, offering a lot of aid and donations for the Afghanistan reconstructions before the Taliban was coming to power and captured the power this time. But I think what is really astounding about Indian foreign policy approach towards Afghanistan issue is that India has supported the peace process in the Afghanistan before this Taliban regime took over the power. And probably India has talked to the regional actors there, not only with Afghanistan directly, but also with a lot of major countries, including with China, when it comes to reconstruction process in Afghanistan. For example, let me give you one example that before this Taliban regime captured the power again a year back, both India and China were training the Afghanistan officials, national security officials. So there has been joint efforts with a range of countries to rebuild Afghanistan process, peace process in Afghanistan, about the nation rebuilding process in Afghanistan. So I think we should not really confuse between the India's pointed alignment strategy with the engagement process, the peace process that India wants to build in the regions. And I think a stable and peaceful Afghanistan and also a stable and peaceful Pakistan is in India's interest, because given the kind of past history, the kind of terrorist attack, the kind of extremist violence, and the kind of activities, illegal activities that has been carried out in the Afghanistan-Pakistan regions, we know for a fact that UN has listed so many terrorist organizations in the regions. And we know for a fact that Pakistan and particularly Pakistan and Afghanistan under Taliban regime has not really been a region, stable regions out there, stable region out there. And I think considering all of those aspects, probably a stable Afghanistan and a stable Pakistan is in India's interest. But while saying that, probably India under the current foreign policy trajectory has become much more nationalist when it comes to Pakistan issue, but much more a kind of a much more imposing actor, a much more imposing foreign policy when it comes to the Afghanistan issue. So there is a distinction has to be made. India's approach to Afghanistan and India's approach to Pakistan are different currently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. That was very interesting. Moving towards Mr. Gopi, we have a question for you by Malaka Khalid. As you mentioned that India is moving towards geo-economic, we still see increasing Indian strategic alliances and agreements related to arms. Would you please comment on it?
Yeah, so that my question basically was, like the UAE foreign minister recently said when there was this ITU summit taking place, he said, through economics, we're going to have peace in the region. And that is the only way. So in that particular context, when ITU was about to be introduced, the understanding is that geopolitics hasn't worked. Geopolitical issues are sort of playing a limiting factor in India's relationships with outside countries. And especially before the emergence of ITU, we already had widespread economic relations with UAE and Israel. So in that particular sense, and US playing a facilitated role, India was sort of using economics as a middle ground to ensure that relationship with these countries have increased. That could be a model for other countries as well. India, under Prime Minister Modi, has adopted economic diplomacy, and so that is one of the ways in which it doesn't mean at the same time that US is not, India is not willing to upgrade its power capabilities in terms of military might as well. It is essentially important that India's foreign policy is sort of balanced between material and ideational interests. So there is a sort of a balancing act. If India has to become a great power, military power is equally essential. So this is not an either-or situation. But when it comes to countries like UAE and Israel, India has made a lot of inroads into these two countries, especially because of the geoeconomics part of it, and that is actually really helpful. If you look at UAE-Israel relations as well recently with the Abraham Accords, that has taken a lot of ascendancy because of the economic relationships, and so that is my response. Thank you.
Sure. There's another question for you, Mr. Gopi, that responding to a question about India participating in military exercises hosted by Russia in a press briefing on August 17, the spokesperson for the US Department of State, Ned Price, said that the US recognized the long-standing relationships of other countries with Russia. The question is that why is the US so magnanimous towards India? Is it because of the international political weight of India alone, or there are other reasons for that as well?
That is an interesting question. Although we'll have to, since we're talking about strategic autonomy, I'll go from that particular point of view. India is taking a key role in the region, and what India's and US interests match in a few areas, and they obviously digress in other areas as well. India likes to adopt strategic autonomy also because India doesn't like to play second fiddle to any other power. So that is one. Secondly, why does India, why is US so magnanimous towards India? US is obviously shifting away from the Middle East and going towards Asia. And obviously, US-China relations are troublesome at this point in time. In India, China relations are also going through a troublesome time. And so there are commonality of interests here. And that could be one reason why India is being approached by the US to also play burden sharing opportunities, because we have had this particular comment by Barack Obama when he was in his tenure that there are a lot of free riders in the world, and we want countries in the region to play to take more opportunities to burden sharing or to stabilize the particular region. And so that is where I think US wants India to play a larger role to counter China at the same time, because there are obviously in India's interests as well. That could be one reason. And also because of the fact that, there's a question of what kind of a power India is going to be. And is it going to be benevolent power, or is it going to be a malevolent player? Considering that India is also a democracy, there are mutual alignment of interests between India and US. And so that could be the second reason why India is being approached by the US.
Thank you, Mr. Bhamidipati. We have one more question for Dr. Arshad. If you could please answer border tensions tensions between India and China. It could be a reason behind India's muted response on One China policy during Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. The person just wanted to know that whether this muted response is transitory or New Delhi has taken a stand not to uphold One China policy.
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Border tensions between India and China could be a reason behind India's muted response on One China policy during Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Whether this muted response is transitory or New Delhi has taken a stand not to uphold One China policy.
I think when it comes to India-China, so they have somehow tried to resolve their issue, not resolve, but to try to manage their conflict. And this can we see when Rajiv Gandhi visited China back in 1988-89, and he tried to resolve, or at least try to manage those territorial disputes. And since then, we haven't seen any kind of skirmishes or fight going on until recently. But recently now we have seen that there is this issue arise. But again, like at the same time, we look into both China and India, they have somehow maintained in terms of like economic relationship. And we see that the trade relationship between India and China has been around $125 billion annually. So this shows that on one side they say that, okay, we have disputes, but at the same time they have maintained their trade. So when it comes to that, so I don't think so that India is against one unit or China, or they're opposing that. Although they are in line with the US in different multilateral forum, but since as we have discussed that India is trying, or India has maintained it's non-aligned or maintain its strategic autonomy. So India is trying to have somehow to resolve their issues with China, and then it would be based on mutual respect. Like recently there is this debate or has been going on between the two countries, and then they will try to reach out to some sort of solution to the problem. So I think Dr. Jagannath and Mr. Gopi will be more elaborate on this question.
Does any of the other two speakers would like to comment on the question? The floor is open.
I think when it comes to India-China boundary dispute, I think not only India has managed to maintain a kind of a keep going approach with China, but at the same time, India has been quite stubborn, assertive, and quite aggressive in terms of not really succumbing to any kind of Chinese pressure. So I think this is an interesting aspect of Indian foreign policy, that China management has been one of the core focus. But today, I think in fact, even though we know for a fact that the Chinese economy is much more in a higher space of domain, 4 to 5 times of Indian economy, Chinese military is very powerful today. But still, I think the government in Delhi and the kind of foreign policy, assertive foreign policy we have in the regions today, probably India is not really succumbing to any Chinese pressure. And I think that is one of the distinct feature of India's China policy, that previously India was much more accommodative to the Chinese interest. Today, that accommodation is becoming a secondary issue. India is ready to confront, and India is ready to maintain a much more assertive foreign policy when it comes to Chinese, contesting with China on various issues. Let me share with you one example. The 2017 Doklam incident probably was an eye-opener in many sense, probably because the Chinese side never imagined and never thought that India will cross the international line of actual control and go and stand in the Doklam regions to confront with the PLA for 73 days and not allowing the PLA to construct the roads out there. And I think that explains a lot about the nationalist foreign policy today we have. And I think this foreign policy is not to compromise, not to take a soft stand when it comes to the territorial matters, not to compromise and not to show any kind of flexibility when it comes to India's national security interest. But while saying that, India still wants to have a much more managing approach when it comes to China, because China is a critical economy, China is a critical partner, China is a strong multilateral partner in Euro-ASEAN regions when it comes to Indian foreign policy. So therefore, India would like to manage the relationship with China without really making it a no-go kind of a foreign policy approach towards China. And so therefore, you will see that boundary aspect is just one aspect. But again, beyond the boundary aspect, India shows a lot more maturity in terms of approaching China and handling the China challenge. But when it comes to the boundary issues, there is no flexibility in Indian foreign policy at this moment, which is visible under the Modi government or under the current government in Delhi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. That was very explaining. I have one last question for you. How do you observe India's rising power aspirations when it comes to dealing with evolving global order? Does equidistant foreign policy would create more challenging situations than opportunities, especially navigating its relationship between US and China?
Is it for me?
Yes, that is directed to you.
Can you please repeat the question, please?
Yeah, sure. Give me a minute. Okay. How do you observe India's rising power aspirations when it comes to dealing with evolving global order? Does equidistant foreign policy would create more challenging situations than opportunities, especially in navigating its relationship between the US and China?
I think when it comes to the US-China rivalry, India does not want to be caught in the middle. And I think that's the foreign policy stand India has been taking. And therefore, let me link this question with some of the other questions that has been posed. There was a question about why US is showing so much, magnanimity in terms of supporting India. I think the primary reasons why US wants to be with India and the US is showing a lot of support towards India, because India is the fulcrum of Indo-Pacific and the US does not really want to lose India as a partner. There are greater issues in the Indo-Pacific regions today that the US wants to align with with India. And I think therefore, even though there are foreign policy problems, foreign policy differences between India and US on a range of critical global issues, but still US does not want to disown India as a partner. Let me give you 2-3 examples. When it comes to the North Korean issue, India and US are not on the same page. India has a embassy in North Korea, and there has been a continuous pressure from the US to shut down the embassy in North Korea. But India has not really shut down its embassy in Pyongyang. When it comes to Iran issue, on the nuclear issue and imposing sanctions, India and US are not on the same page. When it comes to China containment issue, there are differences between India and US. US pursues a China containment foreign policy strategy. India does not really pursue a containment strategy vis-a-vis China. India follows a much more engaging and managing approach with China. So India is not a part of the containment strategy per se, but India is a part of managing the China challenge per se. So I think there are differences between India and US. So therefore, US does not really see that India is a problematic actor in the longer run, like China, and India does not really confront in US status in the global order. And to that, keeping all of those things in mind, and I think India has shown a magnanimity much more approaching and much more flexible approach towards India. And therefore, the US has decided not to sanction India on purchasing, weapons from Russia, particularly, the weapon that we have been purchasing from Russia, and also on a range of issues. As there was one question which actually pointed out that India participating with the US on a lot of exercises and also in a lot of multilateral forums, and US recognizing that India is a partner country with Russia and China. And I think in a diversified global politics, when multipolarism and multilateralism has been the fulcrum of world politics, US recognizes that India is a critical power, not to really lose and not to really disown in the Indo-Pacific regions, and keeping a broader interest, keeping the broader US interest in mind. I think India has shown that positive interest towards India, even though knowing for a fact that India is strongly connected with both Russia and China in the Eurasian regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. That was very informative. Thank you to all the three speakers. We now move towards the end of the session and closing remarks. I would like to hand over the floor to Ms. Mariam Mastoor, who is a research analyst at the Institute of Regional Studies. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Larry. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Am I audible? Okay. It was indeed an enlightening discussion on understanding India's foreign policy. The strategic autonomy that was set initially in terms of non-aligned movement still seems to steer India in international politics. India has come a long way, reaching nearly 3 trillion of GDP. It has successfully managed to utilize its relations with both the US and China, and even other countries like Russia, Iran, and even Israel. However, with 21% of people living below the poverty line, nearly 8% of unemployment rate, 80% debt to GDP ratio, India needs sustainability in its growth, which can only be ensured if there is peace in the region. The rivalry of the US and China that surrounds the political stage of South Asia is a dangerous gamble. The recent political activity of the US in Taiwan and India's distance from one China policy require caution for the region. Recent studies have shown that Indian economy is in fact dependent on Chinese goods. According to a paper published by ORF, a staggering 70% of electronic components, 45% of consumer durables, 70% of active pharmaceutical ingredients, and 40% of leather goods come from China. India has world's largest pharmaceutical industry, for which 2/3 of its key ingredients come from China. Therefore, in my humble opinion, I would like to share that if India wishes to strengthen itself, it should focus on improving its relations with the neighbors, including China and Pakistan. This aspect was also pointed out by Dr. Jagannath. Anything can be changed, but geography can never be changed. Pakistan is the key with which India's relations with China can also improve. As you've also already mentioned, that India's policy has now become China-centric. Jinnah envisioned India and Pakistan's relationship to be like Canada and the US, but unfortunately, this is not the case. Both countries are consuming their energies in the conflict. The hatred of Pakistan has become a national characteristic for those who wish to be called Indians, coupled with abhorrence for Muslims, where institutions have become partisan. The recent example is the case of Bilqis Bano. Even if the leaders of India would want to mend ties with Pakistan, they won't be able to do it. RSS ideology that has permeated deep into Indian society is regressive. It can halt India's progress and create irreparable fault lines. Therefore, it is imperative for India to address this issue and work for mutually beneficial approach in the region. Only peace in the region can ensure growth and prosperity. With these thoughts, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for sharing their thoughts, and I'm really grateful to the panelists who have joined us from India. It is the first participation, and I hope to see more collaboration in future also. And I would also like to thank the audience for their active participation. So with that, I will hand over the floor to Lareeb.
Thank you, Ms. Mariam. You rightly pointed out that peace in the region is the right approach, and we need to look up to it. With that being said, I would now like to thank our panelist, Dr. Jagannath Pandey, who had to leave for another meeting. I'm very indebtful to him for joining in. He had a very busy schedule, and he joined in. He had to leave for another meeting. Our next panelist, Mr. Gopi, Krishna, Bhamidipati, thank you so much for joining in, and Dr. Arshad Ali, lastly, thank you so much for your valuable remarks and the critical analysis that each one of you have given. I hope the audience have learned much about the trajectory of India's external relations from this insightful discussion. With that being said, I would now like to wrap up this event. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in, and thank you so much for the speakers once again. Wow.
Thank you.